Today we will be talking about social and emotional development in middle childhood. So, as children move into middle childhood, they begin to see themselves in more complex ways. Changes in gender identity and ethnic identity occur. Self concept and self esteem become more realistic than they were in early childhood. Children begin to develop ways to express their emotions, and with this come unfortunate emotional disorders linked with anxiety and depression. Additionally, the media becomes more salient and impactful in a child's world and negatively affects the way a child sees themselves and those around them. Friendships begin to play an important factor in middle childhood as well, and these can also be positive or negative experiences for children. At the end of this presentation, you'll have a clear idea of each of these topics and how they affect a child. First off, as children enter middle childhood, they are better able to think about themselves in more complex ways. Self-concept refers to an idea of the self constructed from the beliefs one holds about oneself and the responses of others. In other words, how you think of yourself based on your own judgments and how others may see you. In the following diagram, we're going to see how a child's self-concept develops throughout time. We can see how children in early childhood see themselves in an all or nothing way with descriptions such as, "I'm never scared." As they get older, a child may describe themselves in concrete terms, saying, "I live in a big house and have a pet fish." Children in middle childhood tend to use a mix of feelings such as, "I was happy that it started raining, but mad because I couldn't play outside." Also in middle childhood, they transition from mixed feelings to using psychological terms, emotions, and attitudes. Therefore, they begin to describe themselves as, "I am a good friend." As you have already learned in early chapters of your textbook, Erik Erikson was a strong believer that a major issue in development is identity. He described a set of psychological stages in which he believed that each stage holds a central conflict that needs to be resolved based on the interaction between our biological development and our experiences in our environment. He described middle childhood as a conflict of industry versus inferiority, where children put aside their childhood fantasies and begin to learn what it takes to be an adult in their society. This eventually leads to social comparison, where children begin to compare their own performance and characteristics to those of their peers or other people. With that said, how do you think these self-concepts change across cultures? Well, in all cultures, individuals define themselves in terms of both individual characteristics and their relationships to others, but the ratio of personal to social references differs between the groups. Whereas Euro-American children use personal references to describe themselves with phrases such as, "I am a wonderful and very smart person." You have a Chinese child who is more likely to use social references and state things like, "I'm my mom and dad's child, my grandpa and grandma's grandson." Now let's steer towards how self-concept relates or differs to self-esteem in the development of a child. As children move from early childhood into middle childhood, their confidence in their own abilities often declines for several factors. At a young age, children get their self-esteem inflated by their parents or their teachers, but as they grow up, they begin to compare themselves to their peers and they begin to see things more realistically. Additionally, when children get feedback on their work in elementary school, this does not affect who they are, where in high school, a student may change their habits to better themselves in the future. Furthermore, today images seen on media are unrealistic and can affect children as young as 6 or 7 years old. Girls this age want to be thinner and boys will want to be more muscular. Women on the media are shown as dependent upon men and secondary to them, while men are seen as independent and in charge of the situation. In addition, negative portrayals of black men and positive portrayals of white men affects black boys negatively and white boys positively. What can you do to help? Well, by encouraging children to take part in activities they enjoy and are good at, such as sports, culture, or artistic activities or hobbies, help children in middle childhood build a positive self-concept based on diverse aspects of the self, not just on physical appearance. In other words, what they're good at will outweigh what they look like. By the time children enter middle childhood, they know what their society recognizes as masculine roles, attitudes, and behaviors, versus feminine ones. Children who are content with their gender role have a higher sense of global self-worth. On the contrary, children not content with their gender role distress in their relationship with peers, and peers see these children as being depressed and anxious. Androgyny is the idea that both sexes can share both feminine and masculine characteristics. In society, this idea is the foundation of people being more accepting of girls playing sports or boys cheerleading or being on the dance team. In addition to gender identity, by the time children enter middle childhood, they begin to form coherent ethnic identities. Children begin to label the ethnic group they belong to by ages 6 to 8 years old. Following this, children understand that differences are based on biological features, as well as social features such as speech patterns and lifestyle by age 7 to 8, and between the ages of 8 to 10, they develop ethnic constancy, which is understanding that race or ethnicity remains the same across time and in different settings. As we continue to learn about the changes that occur throughout a child's development, we will now shift gears to explore how a child's emotional development occurs. As with the media portrayal of gender identities, with emotional development, girls are once again expected to be more emotionally expressive than boys, whereas aggressive behaviors are more accepted for boys. Because of these expectations from society, children undergo fear and anxiety. It is important to understand the difference between fear and anxiety. Fear is a response to a real event, whereas anxiety is the anticipation of events that may or may not occur. While young children are afraid of physical things, children in middle childhood have social anxieties and anxiety about school performance. An anxiety disorder is when anxiety gets so big that it begins to interfere with everyday activities. This affects 15% to 20% of children in middle childhood. Obsessive compulsive disorder is commonly known as OCD, and it's an intrusive thought that pops into a person's mind time and time again. It's important to note that some behaviors in addition to OCD, such as separation anxiety, may be detected earlier, and you can read more about that, separation anxiety and OCD in your textbook. More often than not, parents will pay little to no attention when these disorders rise in their child. However, longitudinal studies of children with anxiety disorders show that these should not be ignored with hopes that they would just disappear, because these disorders lead to bigger problems in young adulthood. Sadness and depression are also common among children in middle childhood. Clinical depression refers to depression that is long-lasting and affects the individual physically, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. An important fact to keep in mind is that contrary to what is expected, in middle childhood, boys are more likely to suffer from depression than girls. Now we move on to peer relationships. A very important factor of peer relationships is social status. Social status is the level of peer acceptance or peer rejection of an individual in a peer group. Researchers have used a technique called sociometry in order to study a peer's acceptance. In this technique, researchers ask children to nominate the children they like most or like least. The table on this slide will show how the results of this technique are then used to identify the overall level of social acceptance or social rejection among peers. To read the table and identify the level of acceptance, we use the level high at the top and the level low at the bottom. To read the table and identify the levels of rejection, we use the level high on the left-hand side and the level low on the right-hand side. The labels within the table all vary in levels of acceptance and levels of rejection. You can have a controversial child, an average child, a popular child, a rejected child, or a neglected child. It all depends on the level of peer acceptance or peer rejection. For example, a popular child will be high on peer acceptance and low on peer rejection because it's higher, closer to the top, and closer to the far right. Make sure to read more about each of these sociometric statuses in your textbook and know how to read this table. In addition to the sociometric status, it is important to be aware of bullying among children in middle childhood. Bullying occurs when a victim is exposed repeatedly and over time to negative actions on the part of one or more other students. There are 3 types of bullying. Physical bullying presents itself through hitting and pushing. Verbal bullying happens when there is name calling, and emotional bullying occurs when there is threatening or intimidating among peers. An uncommonly known fact is that bullies are more likely to be depressed, have poor self concepts, lack self control, and have lower levels of social competence. However, you should note that this does not mean they have a low level of self esteem. Remember that self concept is different from self esteem. So a bully may have poor self concept of school but have a high self esteem. Thus, interventions focus on social competence and not making bullies feel better about themselves. The last topic that I'll be discussing in this presentation is media and social development. Going back to previous slides, I mentioned that media has a very strong impact on a child's development and the way they portray themselves and the way they portray others. As you may remember from Chapter 2 of your textbook, Albert Bandura's theory provides insight on how media affects social development for children. Bandura's study consisted of children watching a film in which an adult attacked a Bobo doll. The children were then placed in a room with a Bobo doll in which, on their own, they demonstrated acts of violence towards a doll. Since that time, a clear and consistent picture has emerged, namely that watching violence or playing video games promotes aggression in young viewers. Viewing violent television at ages 2 to 5 is linked with greater aggression at ages 7 to 10. The reason that violent video games increase aggressive tendencies is because the players are acting out the violence instead of just watching it. Make sure to read more about aggression in children in your textbook and identify what are some ways to cope with this.